Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in again. So, this afternoon, this nice Monday afternoon, with a few rays of sunshine, I am going to talk about a wonderful site in the Urals in Russia called Arkaim, and also about the Indus Valley civilization because they have so much in common, despite the fact that they are separated by thousands of miles, lots of mountains and rivers, and although there is a plain that goes straight through, you can actually stick to the flat ground, it's just a bit longer. So, first of all, I have to declare my interest. I don't believe the dates that we are being given. I'm quite sure that we're looking at something circa 15,000 years old, pre-flood, but beautifully constructed, absolutely wonderful. And yes, they do use mega blocks for foundations, megaton blocks. They do use huge slabs as part of the construction, but they also use baked red bricks as they did in the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization. Now it's very interesting because the size of the brick has not changed in all that time. We are still using the same size brick. Now we have a couple of problems with these two major civilizations, and that is that with the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, we can't translate the writings and the seals that they left us. We haven't found a Rosetta Stone yet. We do know, however, and this is in the description in the links I've given. Now, I didn't do a reading list because a reading list is really long, and I'm trying to edit that down a bit. So I've just put podcasts that are very concentrated. They don't last that long, but there's a nice chunk of information in each one, and one or two are quite light and pleasant. But I've put 5 stars next to the last two podcasts because they really are meaty and they've got real information there. So, Arkaim has been nicknamed the Russian Stonehenge, but it's not a Stonehenge in that it's just a nice big solar, lunar, stellar calculator. It does all that. It also incorporates the golden ratio, but it is absolutely fantastic town planning. And it's in a circle, and they do use, as I say, these huge blocks, which had to be transported from miles away because there aren't any quarries nearby. And then they use the red bricks. Now, the irrigation plus the sewage, sanitation is state of the art. We haven't done anything better since. And yes, it did include excess capacity. And none of the used water ever gets mixed with the fresh water. And it is evacuated in such a way that there's no way it's going to pollute existing rivers, streams, or the land. It's evacuated absolutely brilliantly. And they're also very advanced when it comes to thermodynamics as well, because they had furnaces that could reach 800 degrees centigrade, which for the time is way in advance. They were doing bronze, they were doing all sorts of smelting, and they were firing their own bricks, as were the Harappans, which were in North India. Now, they also had a very good social organization. It looks quite orderly, quite simplified as well. Um, and you don't see a cult of weapons and a cult of barracks and social control. Now, they did make weapons, they obviously did have to defend themselves, and they did have a moat, and they had walls that were about 15 feet high, and in some cases even higher, as did the Harappan civilization. But it would seem that this was just so that you could go to bed at night knowing that everything was locked up and all was well. and that no one was going to wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning because the hordes are coming. So both the Harappan and the Arkaim site all have these alignments to the summer solstice as well as stellar lunar movements. They also had a system of weights and measures. Now, in all my research, I have not seen any equivalences or any tables of equivalences or any indication whatsoever as to their means of exchange. But if you have a system of weights and measures, then you must also have a system of exchange. Is one chicken worth 12 eggs, or is one chicken worth half a pound of butter, or whatever, right? And this is because we haven't been able to translate their system of writing in symbols. Though in the Indus Valley civilization, there are approximately 400 symbols, but those symbols may not be words, they could be phrases as well. They could have double meaning, which was recently discovered with Egyptian hieroglyphs, is that it does represent a letter, but it can also represent a specific phrase given the context as well. Now, the interesting thing is both civilizations made lots of toys for their children, which is very interesting. And the toys for the children were not arms-based. It was very much based on celebrating domestic animals, celebrating the wheel. They had lots of wheelie toys for them to play with. So the rivers near the Arkaim are named after the Ganges, which is very interesting. And the architecture of both the sites in the Indus Valley civilization and at Arkaim are also based on something called a mandala. Now, a mandala is squares concentrically placed within circles that are concentrically placed. And the mandala is something you don't do by yourself. You make it out of coloured sand, and it's a group work of about 3 or 4 people. And it's a spiritual message. It's a bit like looking up your horoscope, except you make it as you go, and it warns you of good things coming, bad things coming, whatever. And it's still used to this day in Tibetan culture. It's Tibetan Buddhism. Okay. The swastika is prevalent in both these civilizations, and even you can find swastika on certain Greek helmets. Now, the swastika has been proved to be at least 12,000 years old, so it's not far off my guesstimate, which is based on what I've read and all the YouTube videos and other videos that I've ingurgitated over the years. So that it only engages me, right? But I reckon it's all pre-flood. Now, we did find, thanks to other archaeologists working on something else, that Indus Valley civilization actually had an interpreter at one stage based in the Red Sea area where there was a lot of business going on. Now, in the description, I've also put a history of trade routes, but it doesn't go back far enough for Arkaim and the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization, all the archaeologists think that they just traded eastwards towards Arabia, towards the Red Sea, and so on. But, fortunately, there is proof that with DNA you can actually trace the fact that there were people moving north to south and from west to east, which means that there was traffic both ways as well prior to the acknowledged trade routes. And the Silk routes go back a long time, and once again it's not being acknowledged that there are Silk routes that are pre-flood, but even the ancient Greeks knew that the Indians were the most populous people on the planet at the time, simply because they didn't have any information about China, which hadn't been unified. And India at the time wasn't unified either, but India was trading with the Greeks via the Middle East. So, the weights and measures, given that they are sharing knowledge about solar, stellar, and lunar movements, there has to be some overlap on weights and measures. There has to be, eventually. Now, once again, they predate, as far as I can see, and if they don't predate, then it's more or less overlapping with the Sumerians. And it's very interesting that the Sumerians weren't trading with these people. Now, Mohenjo-Daro is probably the biggest of the Harappan sites in northern India. There are quite a lot of these city sites, and they're all based more or less on the same architecture, though in certain areas you do actually have social hierarchy in the architecture. There are some very important buildings that differ from the average dwelling, which you don't have, interestingly enough, at Arkaim. This is interesting. Now, the other thing is, Arkaim was well defended, but there's no record of any wars. And the Indus Valley civilization as well does not show any huge visceral conflict between cities or cities with outside sources coming in to invade, coming in to rape, pillage, burn. This is very, very interesting. So both civilizations just, it's like turning a light out, they just disappear. Now, so far there seems to be a lack of skeletons. There aren't any mummies. And because we can't translate that which they did write, we don't know what happened. Now, it could have been the Younger Dryas. That's highly plausible. It could have been because the weather patterns changed, the crops failed, the rivers either flooded or dried up. There's all sorts of possibilities. And once again, after all the research I've done on this, the lack of geological evidence pointing one way or another conclusively is very difficult to come by. So it's an open season on what the downfall of these civilizations were. But what we do know is through the DNA that these people were going backwards and forwards, east to west, west to east, and north and south. And hence the shared symbolism, the swastika just being the most obvious. There are a couple of others which you can see in the videos in the description. Right. Now, it's very interesting because it's so homogeneous, it's so standardized, it's quite fascinating, it really is. Especially when it comes to sanitation, the kilns, the products they made, the toys and the utensils. Now, it's very interesting. What I didn't see was a mention of amber anywhere, which is interesting. I didn't see any reference to horses, which in the Urals would be quite useful. Lots of references to domestic animals like goats and cows and chickens and all that. Definitely lots of travel. Right? They were traders. They definitely did go all over the place and ply their wares and imported as a result as well. I'm looking at my notes here. Now, yes, at Arkaim you do have magnetic anomalies the same way you do at Stonehenge, but in certain of the Indus Valley sites that has been noted as well. Now, the water management is something that both civilizations mastered brilliantly. So there must have been something very, very, very dramatic for both these civilizations, which were both agrarian and manufacturing and trading, to suddenly just disappear. So it's quite a mystery. You're dealing with very, very clever people, and it's a shame we can't read what little they left us. It's a great shame. And perhaps other civilizations, when we decipher what they have written, or we start revising that which we think we know, might actually bring forth some light on this. However, one thing is certain, they were connected to the global community at the time. That is really clear. And that's shown up in the DNA as well as the trading routes. So that's very interesting. Now, we don't even know what their religion was. We know that astronomy and Mother Nature was definitely incorporated into their architecture, and obviously for growing of crops and land husbandry as well as animal husbandry. They were definitely way ahead on that score. Very advanced civilization. One of the first to use bronze, and we know that the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization had to import tin. They did have copper locally, or not too far away. And we know that jade later on became something to trade as well, and then silk much later on, but that's really much later on. What were they trading apart from metals and finished goods and perhaps textiles? What was the motivation for the exchange? We don't even have that with the relics we have, which is also very, very interesting. Now, what I also found interesting was that in both cases we're not finding a lot of bodies, which with DNA testing and other things, and just looking at the skeleton to see if he's been beaten to death or had his head hacked off or whatever, we're not finding anything along these lines. And once again, the weights and measures, we don't have anything on that. They're sharing knowledge about the solar, stellar and lunar movements, so there has to be some system at work there, and there has to be a system for their weights and measures, because we have the scales, we have the weights, but no one's writing about is this equivalent to, say, Egyptian measures or Sumerian measures, where everything was wonderfully recorded. And in fact, Alexandria, the library there, was also the tax records office, interestingly enough. So we don't have any tax records, and even if we did, we don't know how to translate them. But they look like, given that you have these toys, given that you have an affluent society with a high standard of living, you don't see violence. You do see very nice objects, very well crafted metalwork, crafted pottery, standardization, the bricks being an excellent example. So who gave them this technology, or where did they get it? Why is it that there are no translating documents, no Rosetta Stones, that we do know there was a translator? Well, didn't he keep records in both languages or several languages? I mean, there seems to be a veil over some of the information concerning these two civilizations, which were obviously in touch. Now, I don't know why there would be an information block there, but I do know that the indications are they lasted for thousands of years, especially the Indus Valley one, and that they lived peacefully, which would be a very good lesson for us. So I think it's very much in our interests to follow their example and to find out more about them. They're very, very, very worth getting into. Now, I've discovered a researcher, changing the subject completely, who has written some very fascinating books and who's done some fantastic podcasts. It's kept me busy all this weekend, actually. And I'm going to do a podcast on ET interaction and conversations because he is really worth listening to. It validates a lot of the other work from very well-known researchers. It validates a lot of channeling. It validates all sorts of other things. And if anyone knows a good channeler who could go back to Arkaim and the Indus Valley civilization and tell us what happened, that would also be very interesting. Now, Arkaim is now a national treasure in Russia and was even visited by Mr. Vladimir Putin himself. So it is something along the lines of Stonehenge and a national treasure. And with that, I will leave you. Do enjoy the last two videos in the description. They're well worth watching. And you will be scratching your head just like I have been, because these civilizations do have a lot to offer us, especially as they lived for so long and so peacefully. And on that note, I shall wish you an excellent evening and thank you so much for your time. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and there's also a link to my PayPal for any donations you care to make. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.